Onward we go. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I'm Greg Hoffman. He is Logan Paulson. So Josh Harris spoke today. I was there for the press conference as we're recording this, so about an hour ago. He described what he hopes will be a thorough but rapid process to hire the lead football executive and ultimately head coach. I thought it was interesting. He said that, he doesn't have, he has a structure in mind. He would like to hire some kind of chief football executive, whether that's a GM or they have another title, and let that person help hire the head coach. But it definitely sounded like if they either fall in love with the head coach and that person has options and they have to make a call without the GM being hired, they will. I'm just going to refer to this football person as a GM from now on to make that clear. Then they will. It also sounded like if it's going to take giving that person some kind of personnel control, that they would potentially do it. Basically, he's like, we will be flexible with the talent. I want the best talent here. Now, I don't know that they're going to do that. And I do think that they'll probably be very diligent about that. They don't want to give someone too much power, a la what's kind of been the downfall of Belichick in New England. And frankly, was a problem with Ron here, too much on his plate. And Josh did describe how he feels like head coach is an 80-hour-a-week job and lead football executive GM is an 80-hour-a-week job. And there's definitely two jobs there. So
that's, I think that's good insight though, honestly. But it's funny you mentioned that. I was just looking at this list you sent me, and there's one guy on the list that you're like, he would want personnel control, and that's Harbaugh, right?
Yeah.
And so if that's what they got to do to get him here, I'm sure they would be like, oh yeah, we'll make something happen.
Which would be interesting because Jim, of the guys that are there, I think they're all good. So as we're recording this, it's 2:20 on Monday. And the list so far of people that they have said they're going to reach out to and request interviews for are Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn of the Lions, Anthony Weaver of the Ravens, Raheem Morris, of course, used to coach here in DC, but currently the defensive coordinator for the Rams. And then apparently they have reached out to Jim Harbaugh's agent, Don Yee, who represented Tom Brady, amongst others, for a long time. But Harbaugh has been very clear that he's not listening to anything from the NFL until tonight when the national championship game with his Michigan Wolverines ends. So he's a guy that is obviously a phenomenal coach.
Does he get you excited? I know
he's great. He's one that's so interesting to me because I have no doubt if Jim Harbaugh was here, they'd win. Yeah. I also have no doubt he'd be gone in 5 years because he irritates the hell out of people.
That's what he does. But that's, you create a winning culture, and his resume is fantastic.
It's unbelievable.
When you look at it, and obviously my father-in-law is a big Stanford guy, big San Francisco 49ers guy, so watching what he was able to do to both those organizations, what he did at the D2 level at San Diego, not San Diego State, University of San Diego.
Oh yeah, that's what it was.
And then to go to Michigan, which everyone thought would never outshine Ohio State and out-recruit and out-coach and out-tough those teams. Definitely they would win football games.
100%.
But he does have a reputation for being...
he's got a shelf life.
Yes, that's exactly right.
But then again, I don't know how much you worry about that because most coaches don't really last that long in the league unless you're like Belichick or Mike Tomlin, who's just, finished year 17. Most coaches, if you can get into a second contract, you've done an unbelievable job. And so I don't know how much I'd worry about that because I'd be just as worried that I'm not even going to put a name on that list, but that Coach X is also not going to have a shelf life longer than 5 years because they're not going to win enough.
Right.
So it is there is that. But I think what was good about what Josh had to say today is he clearly understands the cohesive thing. Right. That thing that we talked about in the first segment that Ron never really got here of I want my front office and my coaching staff to be on the same page and have a vision for what this team looks like. And it's funny. I don't know if that's the right word. It's ironic that Ron didn't have that because Ron was both the coach and the front office. Yeah. But it didn't happen. So
but I think that also speaks to how weird that first year was for Ron, where he's in part, he's sick and he's kind of making all these decisions, and then eventually it kind of settled in when the Martys got there, right? But it took a minute, right? And I think he did understand it, but again, it kind of goes back to that.
But it also shows the skill sets, right?
100%.
Can you 100%. You think you know what you want as a coach, but can you find it as a talent evaluator?
Right. And do you have the time? I love that analogy. They're both 80-hour-a-week jobs. You need to find two people that are very smart. And I think, sorry to cut you off, but you look at San Fran, for example, I think they do a great job of there is a personnel department, there is a head coach, but they work very closely together on establishing their cultural identity.
100%. And it's fine for your coach to establish a lot of that identity as long as he really is someone who's going to be there for a long time. But then ultimately, do you have the people to execute it.
Yeah.
Because everyone always wants to make it into like what happens in the draft room, who has the final say, and like there's going to be some warring of the words with two sides standing on tables throwing helmets at each other, and it's like you've done that work beforehand because you work together. Though speaking of the front office side, as of again when we're recording this, they've already put in requests for Adam Peters of the 49ers, Chiefs assistant general manager Mike Borgonzi, Eagles assistant GM Alec Hallaby, who's a big analytics guy. Obviously, I would assume that Harris is somewhat familiar with how the Eagles are run from his time running the Sixers before Jeffrey Lurie might have known that was a future spy. And then you got Ian Cunningham from the Bears and Glenn Cook from the Browns, both of whom are very, very highly thought of assistant general managers. But I just think that the general like, I got this, I know what I'm doing nature of Josh Harris is really impressive. Yeah. And, we've seen a lot of different owners across sports. And how many different owners do we see, especially NFL owners, that like they speak and you're like, that guy's lucky he's rich. And like Josh Harris, you hear him speak and you're like, I know how that dude got rich.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
he's really smart.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. It's nice to see that here. It's nice to, and again, it's always juxtaposing it to the person that was here before, like just someone who's can be very outward facing and articulate themselves and is comfortable in front of the camera and has some kind of engagement while also remaining kind of professional. And we've seen it not go well in other organizations. Like I look at Carolina right now, and that's a tough deal. So, but I think it seems like he's got the process sound out. And also, I was just looking at these candidates again while you were talking, and it seems like they've identified guys that have strong kind of cultures of toughness. Like you look at the Detroit Lions, look at the Baltimore Ravens, look at Jim Harbaugh, like that's his thing, right? And even Raheem Morris to a certain extent, like when you watch what they're doing in LA, like that's an established culture of winning, right? Since Sean McVay's been there. So I do think it's a very kind of unique and very specific, in a general way, very specific type of guy that they're looking for.
Right. And I think everyone always gets focused on, I don't say everyone gets focused on the wrong things. Sometimes people get focused on the wrong things. Offensive, defensive, this, that. Right. Oh, we want a guy that's coached both sides of the ball. I love a tight ends coach.
I love a tight ends coach
because they understand the run game and the pass game. And like all those things are pertinent information, but like the overarching theme, the overarching thread that ties them together is that toughness element. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And do you have that from a culture standpoint? Speaking of culture, I do want to get back to the name specifically in a second, but I think to start a little broader, they hired Bob Myers, which it's so to be clear, based off what Harris said today, both Myers, the former Golden State Warriors chief executive who helped build this dynasty, obviously Steph Curry is the most important piece of that. If you can get a Steph Curry as a basketball player, you're going to win a lot of basketball games.
All the pieces that you're going to find there, right?
Sure. But like Curry and some of the luck they had in terms of their personnel, contract that they were able to sign him to, which allowed them to do other things. Yeah. All that's great. Like I would tell you as someone who is a massive NBA fan, who is a big fan of the Warriors because I just love the way they play and has been following this thing for a long time. Steph Curry is the most important to the person of the Warriors dynasty. Duh. I could make an argument Bob Myers is the second. Like from the other moves he made to how he built the organization to him being a person that from a culture standpoint was an enforcer of the culture, but also kind of a therapist of the culture. Right. Like Draymond Green and Bob Myers, and Draymond Green obviously is a very tough, interesting personality, right? Someone who I'm a huge fan of, but like Draymond's got his issues, and he's been working through them, specifically in the last 2 months. Myers was someone who really was able to work with Draymond on a lot of stuff, and kind of kept the boiling or the water at the right temperature to be hot enough that they would win, but not boil over. Like he was an active a part of that, as was Steve Kerr, obviously the head coach. So when you talk about hiring someone to help build a culture, and even if he's not going to be involved much past this search, he is, I think, a tremendously interesting person, and I would say a smart person. And what Harris said today is he is probably going to continue to advise Harris past this search. It won't be anything formal. He's not going to be the team president, nothing like that. It sounds like anyway, but he will be an advisor. Then the other guy they hire is Chris Spielman, longtime executive in the league, 10 years with the Vikings, is one executive of the year, and that joins Mitchell Rales, obviously Josh Harris and Magic Johnson as the predominant people who will be conducting the search.
Yeah, I think that's exciting for me, and I think when you're talking about, oh, this is a football organization, what does he know about it? But I think you mentioned the cultural element, right? Understanding the pieces, the leadership, and kind of that je ne sais quoi that we talk about in relation to quarterback all the time, but how are you as a leader of men? And I remember, in Sean McVay's, interview process with the Rams, they interviewed Marshall Faulk, not because Marshall Faulk is this great football insight, because they felt like Marshall Faulk's a good leader and he could identify someone that could get the guys to rally behind him. And it sounds like this guy from the Golden State Warriors is that guy. And then you couple that with the GM background or the executive background of the guy from Minnesota. I forget his name at the moment. Chris Spielman. I think that's a very, very potent mix of things. A guy that is super dialed in on the football side, a guy that has made a winner at the highest level, right, in the basketball world. And I think both those things coming together work in a really, really nice fashion. And then add in, the ownership group as it exists and Magic Johnson, all that stuff. It makes me excited that a good decision can be made here with a lot of clarity.
Yeah. I mean, to me, if you can sit down in a room and you can impress Bob Myers, who has won 4 NBA championships. And by the way, before that, championship player at UCLA as a player. And then he was an agent for a long time. So he has worked on all sides of the sports business. He knows a lot of people as well. So when you talk about doing some of that research that kind of happens in the background, Bob Myers is very qualified to do it. You can sit down and impress him. Magic Johnson, one of the greatest winners in the history of pro sports. Josh Harris, who absolutely built a behemoth in the finance industry. True. Mitch Rales, who's built multi-million-dollar companies. And who am I forgetting? Oh, and Chris Spielman, who was a longtime NFL player and a great executive for a long time. If you can impress those people, you're probably qualified for the job. And then my one concern, right? Concern's too strong. The one thing that I'm interested in making sure that they overcome is it's not a lot of football experience. And so when you talk about someone who has that football vision, obviously there's a lot on Spielman's plate there, but I think that thing is more important for the head coach than it is the GM.
I was going to say, what I would hope is that they hire a VP of football ops, a GM, whatever that person is first. And again, not that they're
that's their plan, just to be clear.
Not that that guy's going to be making the coaching hire, but at least you have a sounding board from a more football-centric perspective that kind of gives you, hey, I can work with this guy. He's got a good reputation. He or she has a good reputation. And I think that's ultimately kind of what you said they're planning on doing. And I think that feels like the right decision, because a GM, while important for football ops, very critical in terms of vision, is a different type of vision than what you're going to see from your football coach. And I think that group seems to be at the moment very, very qualified to identify that kind of talent, and then using that as a resource, identify the head coach.
Right, because your GM needs to be able to hire scouts that kind of get at that granular level. And of course, if you have a GM with a scouting background, that person's scouting ability becomes very important. But that's,
because really it's about finding someone who, again, has this vision you're describing, right, for the organization, and then can distill copious amounts of information. Yes. Right? That's really what it ultimately comes down to. And it's the vision, the copious amounts of information, then how are they to work with, right? In terms of compromising and dealing with other people. So it's nothing I think overly complicated. It's just about making sure you identify the right person for this position and the vision of the ownership group and what they think for the franchise.
And so then you have 2 football people in the room to talk ball with the head coach candidates. Yeah. And so what that'll look like from a timing standpoint is there are virtual interviews that can happen up until basically January 22nd. They happen in smaller windows, and it's different for people that currently have jobs with clubs that are in the playoffs versus don't, and it's very convoluted. I read the rules and was like, I still don't fully understand this. Which might have something to do with my reading comprehension at 10 o'clock last night at FedEx Field or whatever the hell time it was. I don't think it was that late. Anyway, point is, they'll do that. And so they'll cast a very wide net, because if you don't do that first round of virtual interviews, then you can't get someone for an in-person and ultimately hire them down the road. So they'll cast a very wide net, get a bunch of virtual interviews done, hopefully within these next couple of weeks, hire that football person, and then conduct the final round of in-person interviews, hire a head coach. And I think the phrase that Harris used was great, because I always worry about the timing of these things too, of if you want to hit the ground running your first season, you can't, if you're stuck waiting because your coach wins the Super Bowl, okay.
Right.
But you would ideally like to hire your head coach before the Senior Bowl.
Yeah, I mean that's usually how it plays out, right? Like there was a couple of years where like D'Amico Ryans is left out of the coaching cycle because they're pushing deep into the playoffs, or Eric Bieniemy, that was an issue for him for a couple of years in a row, right? So that is a thing that's definitely important in terms of this calculus moving forward.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, you definitely want to have that lead football person in by the Senior Bowl so they can go down, be there, present, running your scouting department, get it as organized as you can within a week, because they probably only have that long, maybe two, to get hired. So that's definitely something interesting to watch from a timing perspective. But hey, if like Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn are your two final candidates and the Lions make the Super Bowl, then you're gonna have to wait to hire a head coach, and that's just the reality of it. Steichen and Gannon dealt with that last year, and for whatever it's worth, like Steichen and the Colts had a pretty good year, so you can certainly
honestly
overcome it.
So did Gannon. I know that was the worst roster in football, and like he was able to kind of cultivate a winning mentality there, scrappy, let's say, which is good in the first year. You want to see that, so
for sure. All right, so let's wrap up with this then. Last few minutes here, the names themselves. I don't know how much tape you've watched of these teams. Obviously, throughout the course of the season, you're naturally going to get some of them because they're Commanders' opponents, or as you're scouting the Commanders' opponents, you see them. Ben Johnson is the belle of the ball. I saw that shout out to Ben Standing. I think he used that phrase, and I don't want to rip it off from him and not credit him because that's a terrible thing to do. So he is the guy that is going to be the top candidate overall. What do you make of him, his background? Got some tight ends coaching, got some quarterbacks coaching, played quarterback. And obviously the last 2 years, the Lions have been one of the best offenses in football.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of those offenses that you really enjoy watching. You know, like in the same way that you turn on Miami, you turn on San Francisco, Houston, and you're just like, wow, they are doing a lot of great stuff here from a protection standpoint, from a run game standpoint. I love the physical mentality that they bring each and every week, much like San Francisco, and then the deep play explosive ability that they generate in the offense and how they deleverage the quarterback spot. And I just think like that's good. That is, to me, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a more innovative offensive football mind outside of those three teams, and it's great that he's going to be a guy that's going to be open for a coaching position. Another thing I like about him is he's worked with Dan Campbell. And say what you want about Dan Campbell from a football X's and O's standpoint, talk about a culture builder. Like he got to see that from square one, taking a loser and turning it into a winner. And so I like that there's that background exposure for him, in addition to all the X's and O's stuff that you see.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this on the pod before, but we had Adam Amin, Fox broadcaster, on a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago. And I asked him, you know, because, hey, you get all these production meetings, you meet with a ton of coordinators around the league. Is there anybody that stands out as a potential head coach? And Adam hasn't had some of the teams with the names on the list, but he'd had the Lions a couple of times. He's like, dude, Ben Johnson is on a different world. He's got that it factor, that dynamic personality that will translate well to being a head coach. Another guy that is definitely a dynamic personality, if you watch Hard Knocks, the Lions edition last year, there was a fair amount of Aaron Glenn. He's an interesting guy to me because he was on the hot seat earlier this year, and they've kind of figured it out enough down in Detroit. And he's a guy that, former player, really good player, by the way, in his days with the Jets. But is he, like, for a guy that was this recently on the hot seat, does that get you as excited, or does it almost get you more excited because he's such, like, he did some of the problem solving that you look for? And
again, like, you're looking for guys that solve problems defensively. I think he falls in that bucket. He's very aggressive, likes to bring a lot of zero pressure. Think, you know, kind of Wink Martindale-ish, you know what I'm saying? We're scheming up protections, we're attacking teams. I think the thing that comes off this list more than anything is they come from tough cultures, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to be hard pressed to find a defensive coach and an offensive coach from a tougher culture than the Detroit Lions, who are both kind of up and coming, optimistic in terms of what they bring from a football standpoint, right? So I think like that's one reason. I don't think it's happenstance that the guy from Baltimore's on there.
Yeah.
I don't think it's happenstance.
Different guy than a lot of people were expecting from Baltimore, though.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
But we'll see. You know, this is a list as of the coaching vacancy that's 4 hours old.
Right.
So.
But I think the thing that jumps out to me is it's not necessarily the X's and O's, because if it's X's and O's, you definitely have Frank Smith on this list. You definitely have probably Bobby Sloak on this. You have different names. This is a culture, mentality type of hire that they are looking for. To me, it seems like, right? And I think obviously you mentioned Ben Johnson. Everyone, like I just said, how great I think he is offensively, at least what he's doing. But the other guys on that list, they are tough sons of guns, right? They come from tough cultures that have won a lot, and they have a good approach. Like even Raheem Morris, like, again, I know LA is a little bit different than Baltimore or Michigan or one of these other teams, but God bless, man. Like that is a winner, and they get the most out of their guys there, you know? So I think that's something else to consider.
Yeah. And I think the last thing think just to kind of circle all of this together, some comments from last night in the locker room and today about, the guy that is probably the toughest on the Commander staff is Bieniemy. And Charles Leno and Logan Thomas said basically the same exact thing, which is like, we butted heads with the guy at times. There were some ups and downs, but he was totally uncompromising and he was the same guy every day. And I thought that was really interesting because that was a way for two guys who were vets to basically be like, yeah, I didn't love this. But I also am going to say something nice enough that I don't come off as a total jackwagon. I'm going to say something nice. I'm going to be a professional. But I do think when we talk about the culture moving forward, that is something that needs to be examined on the roster as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it definitely, like, John Allen had his moments this year in terms of leadership. I mean, for whatever it's worth, like, if you don't post to talk to the media after your final game or for a locker clean out, is it the end of the world? No. But dude, if you're a team captain and you're MIA after the final game of the regular seaseason and you don't post for a locker clean out, it's not a great look.
Right.
And then you got two of your big vets coming out saying like, yeah, I don't know that the offensive coordinator is my best friend, which is not to say that like I'm assigning blame to either the vets or the OC. But when a young guy like Jahan is coming out talking about the leaders on the team, and like we need better leadership from the players, kind of like, you talking about those guys over there, those big tall guys over there?
Right.
And that's the kind of thing that I wonder, if you will.
And I think that's something that we'll learn more about as we get into the off season about, how people really feel about that stuff. Here's like the first domino in terms of real information to fall.
Yeah.
People are going to start talking here before you know it. And I definitely think that's going to be an interesting conversation.
But just in terms of like, when you build the culture moving forward, like you got to make sure your vets, the guys you bring in, are guys that are supportive of your head coach, that are believing in the system. And I mean, again, like you were that guy in San Francisco. Like Kyle brought you in partly because you were a good blocker and he needed someone to block defensive ends.
But definitely more to the latter part of that, where I'm here to kind of help install belief and help get the system across. And that was awesome that he did that. But that is a thing, right? And I look at, again, how San Fran is built and like what they value in certain positions and the kind of guys they get. They're not, they're not the most valuable guys league wide, like Deebo Samuel, good player, right? But he fits what they do really well. Yeah. He's very physical. He's tough, right? George Kittle, physical, tough, like not the most nuanced route runner, but obviously they've prioritized that kind of guy, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like they don't have fun at practice. They do. And I think Kyle has learned how to relate to those guys, but they have, from the GM to the coach, have identified a type of person that they want on that team that fits with their vision. It's the same thing with Seattle. Like, say what you want about Pete Carroll. He does a great job of finding people that fit his vision.
Pete's thing is compete.
Correct.
And he finds competitive sons of guys. Like Devin Witherspoon is a freaking Seahawk, man.
Yeah. And I think, and you just go down the list of what he prioritized. And they're not always guys of the highest character or the best workers necessarily, but they say, we want dudes who are going to compete and they love football. And they get those guys there. And I think that's, again, why this GM to coach is so important for establishing this identity, because they can say, how do we establish this vision? And then again, if it's going to be a very jarring transition, they got to make sure they got the right guy to helm the ship too, or gal while we're here. So
yeah, for sure. And also potentially throw some people into the ocean, so to speak. They'll be fine. Like they're not actually going to like go into the middle of the ocean. But if you have people that don't really fit that mantra and you figure that out quickly, like sometimes in year one of a coaching regime, you get that surprise training camp cut of a veteran. And maybe that's something that this clip looks prescient at the end of this podcast in August as we tape it in the middle, actually the beginning really still of January. Although we're way closer to the middle of January than I want to admit. Anyway, our podcast is over. Thank you so much for listening, not just today, but all season long. Obviously, it has been a tough one to talk about. And, for a podcast that thrives on X's and O's, when the games become a little less relevant, it's not always the easiest show to do, but you guys kept on listening and we really appreciate it. Our draft stuff's going to be awesome. Logan's already started on that. I got my draft prep that I'm starting as well. But I know where our bread is buttered. It's with Logan's, and don't worry, he started. And other than that, we'll be with you 2 times weekly. Our schedule adjusts a little bit here over the next couple of weeks. Obviously, we're always on standby for breaking news as well. But make sure you subscribe. That way you don't miss anything on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app. For Logan, I'm Craig, and we'll see you next time on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.